We are at one of the very exciting moments of this conference, the first of many, I hope, and that is the keynote address. So I have the honor of introducing the keynote speaker for Ismaili Studies Conference 2021, and it's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce him. I first heard of Professor Karim H. Karim from my father, because we kept Professor Karim's books on our bookshelf. And it was one of the first books I was encouraged to read, especially right after 9/11. I think it was Islamic Peril. So I just want to start on that personal note that I have known of Professor Karim for a very long time, but some of you, it was just announced that Professor Karim H. Karim was just appointed as the Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University. So congratulations on that appointment. All of us are extremely proud to hear that news. So Professor Karim is the Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University's School of Journalism and Communication, of which he was one of the previous directors. He is currently the director of the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam. Professor Karim has also served as a director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies and has also been a visiting scholar at Harvard University and visiting professor at Simon Fraser University and the Aga Khan University's joint program. Professor Karim was the winner of the inaugural Robinson Prize for Excellence in Communication Studies for his critically acclaimed book, Islamic Peril, Media and Global Violence, which is the book that we have in my home that I grew up in. A major focus of Professor Karim's current writings is contemporary Ismaili communities, leadership, and institutions. His publications have been extensively cited. Sorry, I lost my train here. Yes, his publications have been extensively cited around the world, and he has been a distinguished lecturer on several continents. He has also participated in scholarly consultations organized by branches of the Canadian and American governments and has been interviewed by major media in several countries. Professor Karim has served in advisory capacities for the Aga Khan University's Graduate School of Media and Communications, Nairobi, Kenya, and University of Central Asia's Communication and Media major. He has been honored by the Government of Canada for facilitating collaboration between religious communities. And the title of Professor Karim's keynote address today is Asking Hard Questions, Soldiers, Scholars, and People of Faith. So Professor Karim, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for also being the one who did the second Ismaili Studies Conference back in 2017. And thank you for your support, both known and unknown, for this conference and your mentorship of me in my own academic career. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Khalil. You're doing a great job. It's been a great start to the conference today. Congratulations. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. First of all, I acknowledge that the land from which I'm speaking is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I note simultaneously that the injustice and inequity under which many peoples of the world live, and express earnest hope that all forms of repression will be ended. Congratulations are due to the conference's organizing committee and particularly the conveners Khalil Andani and Ahab Davi, who have taken up the baton this year to hold the third International Ismaili Studies Conference. As you may know, the first one was convened in 2014 at the University of Chicago, and the second one at Carleton University in Ottawa. These autonomous events are in a fledgling state, and it is vital that we have brave souls stepping up to take up the challenge to organize them. I thank this year's organizers for inviting me to deliver the keynote address. This is a profound privilege and honor. I dedicate my talk to Pyarali Jiva, who passed away earlier this year at the age of 89. His dedication, energy, humility, and purity of purpose in promoting research has been a deep source of inspiration ever since I visited him in his home, in his London home 10 years ago. Pyarali Bhai's strong legacy is an invitation to build on Satpanth research. This keynote address draws on my experience spanning 4 decades of working in communal, media, governmental, and academic institutions. My references will largely be to the Ismaili movement's Nizari branch, with which I am most familiar. It is with sincerity, humility, and caring that I approach this important task. However, some members of the audience may find aspects of what I have to say to be unpleasant. For that, I ask your indulgence and forgiveness. So to start, the Quran frequently encourages believers to use their intellect with which they may comprehend the significance of the signs that divinity has embedded in revelation and creation. Numerous parts of the text exhort Muslims to learn, ta'allum, to reflect, tafakkur, to ponder, tadabbur, and to comprehend, tafaqquh. This seems to stand the materialism of the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, on its head. The Islamic cogito appears very much within a spiritual frame. The use of the intellect in matters of religion has been taken as a matter of faith by many believers who have dedicated themselves to the pursuit of knowledge. Among Muslim groups, this endeavor has been particularly emphasized by Nizaris, Mustalis, and Druze. Their leaders speak of the importance of the intellect, aql, in relation to matters of faith. Preachers, teachers, and thinkers regularly echo this viewpoint. A key historical value of what has come to be known as the Ismaili movement was the pursuit of universal truth, indicated by one of its long-held names, Dawat al-Haq, invitation to truth. Since its emergence in the 18th century, it has consistently named itself in Arabic, Persian, and Indic languages with names that emphasized an aspiration for truth. Ahl al-Haq, Ahli Haq, Ahli Haqiqat, people of truth. Dini Haq, religion of truth. Rah-i Haq, and Satpanth, path of truth. Its proponents consistently wrote about the search for haqa'iq and sat, which denoted universal truths. These aspirations were pluralist, as the Dawa's intellectuals developed a theology that incorporated analogous elements from other religious traditions within a Shi'i framework. Satpanth indigenized the group's beliefs in an Indian context to constitute a path of truth to which the true teacher, Satguru, guides his adherents. The primary means through which these teachings were propagated are the lyrical ginans, whose Sanskrit root relates to knowledge. Another early self-appellation was Dawat al-Hadiya, rightly guiding mission. The term Ismaili did not appear as a primary self-designation in the period during which imams ruled as caliphs. Even the name Fatimid, Fatimiyun, by which contemporary scholarly literature refers to the group's caliphate, only came into use among its proponents in the 12th century in the last phase of the dynasty. Ismaili, the word, coexisted with various other names among Nizari, Mustalian, and Drew's writings before the 20th century. We see self-references among the Nizaris as Ahli Haq well into the 19th century. Nizaris in India did not use the name Ismaili until the late 19th century. At least until the 1970s, the Gujarati sermons of Satpanthi Khoja Waizin referred to congregations as Hakikati Momino, true believers, and Hakikati Deendaro, followers of the religion of truth. Contemporary Nizari prayers ask for Hakikati Samaj, understanding of truth for supplicants. Truth-seeking is a value with which the movement has clearly identified itself. Ideas about the ethical use of the intellect to attain truth underlie its view of the fundamental purpose of human existence. However, this position appears to be in contention with the practical circumstances of organized religion in which the communities find themselves. Excuse me. This is where I would like to pause and submit a dual proposition, which some of you might find discomforting. One, that most Ismaili, contemporary Ismailis, are generally not asking the hard questions that would potentially elicit truths, and two, that Ismailis do not hold an orientation that can enable them to take on the great questions of our time. The broader context of this proposition derives from two speeches that the leader of the Nizaris, the Aga Khan, made in 1986 and 2021, respectively. The first part of this proposition is from an oration that the Nizari Imam made to the head of his institutions in the United States 35 years ago, when he said, quote, "In dealing with the issues that lie ahead of us, we will look at them straight in the face. We will ask the hard questions. If we cannot find immediate answers, we will go on asking the same questions until, inshallah, we are inspired to find the answers, but we will not give up. We will not go back to an obscurantism, to a form of intellectual retreat into something which is neither beneficial for the present and certainly not constructive for the future. It is that simple. And we must have the courage to ask the questions and seek the answers," unquote. These remarks were made in the context of the perceived tendencies of some other Muslims bearing, quote, "today's problems under the dust of the past," unquote. This is whence the first part of this talk's title is derived, asking hard questions. My address redirects the imperative to ask hard questions towards Ismaili communities themselves. I will get to the second part of the title, soldiers, scholars, and people of faith, later in the talk. The second part of the proposition is based on what the Aga Khan said at the inaugural convocation of the University of Central Asia this year in June. Quote, "Students of world history remind us how Central Asia 1,000 years ago led the world in cultural and intellectual achievements. This region is where algebra got its name, where the Earth's diameter was precisely calculated, where some of the world's greatest poetry was penned. This happened because the societies were open to new ideas, open to change, open to scholars and people from many backgrounds. That kind of openness can again unlock the doors to the future and allows us to take on the great questions of our time and place," unquote. The key phrases from this quotation that I would like to examine are, quote, "open to new ideas, open to change, open to scholars, take on the great questions of our time and place, and lead the world in cultural and intellectual achievements." Okay, so let's move on to asking hard questions. To restate my proposition, most contemporary Ismailis of various ilk are not asking the hard questions, and they are not in a position to address the great questions of our time. They have made some laudable achievements, but are nowhere close to leading the world in cultural and intellectual attainments. One of the ironies of the movement, which is heavily given to examining its own history, is the diminution in contemporary times of the primary concept of truth and its quest, with which it closely identified in earlier days. I would now like to spend a couple of minutes on the concept of truth. Ideas about the ethical use of the intellect to attain truth underlie the Ismaili movement's view of the fundamental purpose of human existence. Whereas haq, in the above-mentioned context, refers primarily to deen, it would also potentially be the outcome of asking hard questions in dunya. As happens in most intellectual activities, social factors shape the human pursuit of knowledge. There are several modes of truth-seeking that are present in the larger context of contemporary society. Apart from spiritual endeavor, approaches in various aspects of life include secular philosophical thought, scientific research ranging from laboratory tests to textual study, forensic audits, journalistic investigation, parliamentary inquiries, and courtroom debates. Additionally, the influential 20th century philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer profoundly examines art as an expression of truth. A central method of scholarship is the rigorous questioning of the preconceptions embedded in received accounts. Academic research is centered on the critical scrutiny of ideas and evidence. Universities and other scholarly institutions are mandated to support inquiry that objectively examines quantitative and qualitative data in order to understand social and natural phenomena. But institutional and personal subjectivities often determine the ways in which projects are framed and conducted. Despite aspirations of carrying out quote-unquote pure research, scholarship is usually constrained by social, cultural, religious, political, or ideological preconceptions and goals. Institutions can seek to lessen the influence of these factors by establishing safeguards, such as ethical guidelines. Individuals' personal adherence to integrity and honesty in their research is also important in this respect. But this does not rule out compassion towards the object of research. However, some think tanks may vet their employees' work to ensure only those outcomes that fit within institutionally set parameters. But notwithstanding such practices, the ideal of moving towards truth through scholarship remains an overall societal goal. Absolute objectivity may not be humanly possible, but a sincere intention to study sources dispassionately remains a necessary position for the furtherance of knowledge. Preconceptions and assumptions are unavoidable in a working hypothesis that is formulated at the outset of a research project. However, one needs to be open to considering seriously the findings that may contradict it. This intellectual posture is integral to the critical inquiry that is necessary for the advancement of knowledge. Critical thinking is sometimes incorrectly thought of as criticism for its own sake or as endless argument that is designed to mislead. On the contrary, it involves a commitment to making apparent the preconceptions that distort the formulation of knowledge about a topic. It usually helps in uncovering the biases and manipulation of information that have gone into constructing a particular interpretation that favors a specific individual, institution, or idea. Self-reflexiveness on the part of the researcher constantly questions the perspectives and attitudes that they themselves bring into the inquiry. Conventions of peer review for publications are designed to enable informed assessment by academic referees who are considered knowledgeable in the particular area of research. Blind reviews ensure that the referees do not know the identity of the writer and therefore do not defer to their status or lack thereof. This may not be a fail-safe method, but it is viewed almost universally as the most effective means of ensuring high standards of publication. It is accepted as being far superior to procedures that allow only for internal vetting within research institutions. The development of knowledge and the movement towards truth has shown itself to be a gradual and never-ending process. Discussion and debate are very much part of this journey. Certain intangible factors can also be at play in influencing the agreement with the ideas put forward in a paper, such as the status of a writer or their rhetorical skill. The constitution of quote-unquote truth is less definitive in the humanities and the social sciences than in the hard sciences, although it is not necessarily absolute even in the latter, as discussed in the classic work of the mathematician and philosopher Hilary Putnam. Nevertheless, it is by asking hard questions that we can travel in the direction of truth. A primary challenge facing scholars who are also members of religious communities is to resist communal subjectivities. They are sometimes unaware of their defensiveness in dealing with some of the more prickly parts of their research. There is a propensity to slip into rationalization and apologetics stemming from an often unconscious drive to protect one's community from uncomfortable questions. Such defensiveness fails to produce scholarly credibility and, ironically, does not uphold the integrity and truth that the religion itself demands. One has to endeavor relentlessly to recognize one's own human subjectivity and the biases that flow from it. Practicing self-reflexivity is essential for scholarly analysis. Our moral compass helps us strive constantly to move towards the truth that lies past our own inclinations. The second part of this talk refers to three categories that are distinct but may simultaneously intersect with each other: soldiers, scholars, and people of faith. I will start with scholars. They are generally viewed as people who engage with knowledge. In order to be inclusive of the broad range of persons who may fall into this category in the context of Ismaili communities today, I will refer to it as comprising knowledge workers, including professors and researchers in academic bodies, faculty members in communal research institutions, wa'izin, mullahs, and other teachers of religion. Some of them may see it as their job to ask hard questions. They may seek to engage with problems such as inaccuracies, inconsistencies, blind spots, contradictions, and conundrums. On the other hand, others may actively avoid difficult issues and stick with the certainties of received information. There is an extensive literature on related notions such as taqlid and ijtihad in Muslim thought, which I will not discuss in this brief lecture. My focus here is on the relationship between the three intersecting categories of soldier, scholar, and person of faith in Ismaili contexts. Tenured professors whose freedom of speech is protected more than that of knowledge workers working for communal institutions generally have greater freedom to ask penetrating questions and to make bold statements. Although the situation varies in particular societal, institutional, and individual contexts, professors in non-denominational universities and colleges are generally expected to remain at arm's length from the matters that they study. This intellectual approach is usually viewed as contributing to objectivity. Even those who religiously and culturally identify with the topic under examination adopt an ostensibly neutral position toward beliefs. Indeed, this does not preclude holding a critical intellectual stance as well as compassion towards the subject matter. Scholarly institutions run by religious groups, especially those with the purpose of upholding a particular viewpoint, may expect their faculty members to promote a specific perspective, or at least not challenge the strategically important positions held by the community. They will usually not organize courses, hold public lectures, or publish materials that ask probing questions about their beliefs. Such knowledge politics also use tactics like gatekeeping that restrict access to certain library collections and withdrawing books critical of the community from circulation. Wa'izin, mullahs, religious education teachers, and faculty members in communal research institutions generally find themselves having to abide by these conditions. Some experience crises of conscience about the demands made upon them. Others may continue to give lectures and publish materials that are panegyric in nature. These could be viewed as contributing to the public relations and propaganda efforts of their institutions. This mindset is quite pervasive and extends even beyond communal bodies, with some graduate students working independently also indulging in similar exercises of apologetics. Indeed, I myself engaged in the same way in favor of my own community. Let us now move to the second category, that of soldiers. I use this term metaphorically in the way that it has been expressed by a senior administrative official in a community-affiliated scholarly organization. He told me with great pride that the spiritual head had described him as, quote, a good soldier. The dictionary definition of this term is a loyal and unquestioning follower. It usually relates to following orders and not asking questions about inaccuracies, inconsistencies, or contradictions. The primary objective is to advance the cause. Efficiency and getting the job done are key elements of the soldier's modus operandi. Having worked in government for a decade, I noted the similarities of structure and operation of the civil service with that of the military. Apart from a rigorous hierarchy of command, there exist unspoken areas about which questions are not asked, mostly relating to ideological and political positions. Even though knowledge is valued in the bureaucracy, it is subjected to the epistemological frameworks established by the command structure. In fact, knowledge often becomes an instrument in the service of public relations and propaganda to promote set positions. The extent to which scientific findings have become an object of politics in many parts of the world is an indication of the fragility of ethical structures that would protect truth-seeking. Communal bureaucracies operate in largely similar ways. There are positions to be defended and institutions and leadership to be protected. Systems of approvals are put in place to ensure that the organization is not compromised by statements from within. However, at the same time, religious groups ostensibly uphold the principles of truth and they promote ethics. Whereas some knowledge workers may raise uncomfortable queries about contradictions between principle and practice, good soldiers, by definitions, usually do not ask such questions. When a culture of self-reflexiveness about one's behavior is not deliberately cultivated, ethics are compromised. They are compromised in favor of the single-minded determination to meet objectives. Image management and public relations become the standard modes of operation as opposed to soul-searching about the proper ways to conduct personal and organizational actions. We have a 1,000-year-old example from the time of Al-Hakim, when a major da'i, Ahmad bin Ibrahim al-Naysaburi, responded to deep corruption by writing that the Dawat al-Haq is built on knowledge, God-fearing piety, and good management, ilm, taqwa, and siyasa. And that without them, security, decency, piety, life, honor, and chivalry cease. He warned that chaos will reign in the Imam's community if this continues. The 11th century da'i seems to have been troubled by the conundrum of upholding ideals of truth and dealing with corruption that often attaches itself to the pragmatics of administration. In our times, the Aga Khan Development Network has set a very high bar for itself, namely, quote, to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action, unquote. The network's ethical framework specifies several ethics: inclusiveness, education, research, compassion, sharing, self-reliance, etc. However, this ethical framework is directed towards the conceptualization of the organization and its programs, not the practical operations of its administration. Nepotism, favoritism, influence peddling, harassment, bullying, and other ethical failures in ethics are not uncommon in human organizations. However, one would expect that a body that specifically identifies an ethical foundation as its raison d'etre would foreground ethics in all its aspects. If social conscience is primary, then good soldiers should not only follow orders as an expression of loyalty, but also be rigorously adherent to ethical behavior. This is particularly important for followers of Dawat al-Haq, for whom truth presumably would be the means and the ends. However, when efficiency and getting the job done becomes the most vital aspect of service in institutions, ethics fall by the wayside. One is tempted to do what is easy and expedient rather than the thing which usually requires the right thing, which requires more effort. It is the default practice of most contemporary organizations to acquire the talents of the most efficient and productive technocrats. This sociological term does not apply only to those engaged in the technological sector, but to all those who are proficient in their respective areas of expertise. They are usually not trained to ask hard questions about their activities or to probe inconsistencies and contradictions between theory and practice. Excuse me. It is not my intention to suggest that these are bad individuals, but I am saying that their primary interest is in doing the job and that ethics and truth generally become secondary concerns. Some of them might even pepper their discourse with contemporary buzzwords such as pluralism, meritocracy, social justice, and yes, even ethics. But these values dissipate when they are perceived as coming in the way of meeting a project's objectives. The good soldiers in the managerial and technocratic classes often see knowledge workers who raise difficult questions relating to principles, values, and ethics to be a nuisance. They are either to be tamed or ostracized. In one particularly troubling case in the 1990s, one senior official of a communal institution took it upon himself to hound an Ismaili academic to whose book he strongly objected. Claiming falsely to be acting for the community, he warned the book's university press that it would result in a situation similar to that of Salman Rushdie's publication of the Satanic Verses. Death threats were also issued against the author. Whereas this was an extreme situation, it seems to have risen from the same mindset of knowledge politics that leads to the attempts to control intellectual work. In communal research institutions, it manifests itself in various ways, such as not publishing on certain topics which are deemed quote unquote sensitive, the executive vetting of writing by faculty members and preventing them from attending certain conferences, and holding exclusive invitation-only scholarly gatherings. All this is to ensure a closely guarded and monitored intellectual confine from which individuals who ask hard questions are kept out. The efforts of good soldiers are geared towards promoting an environment in which there are no challenges to the status quo. Discourses that are seen as making probing inquiries about dominant policies, hierarchies, and structures of power are sidelined. Not only does this approach go against the movement's long-held identification with truth, it has a broad impact on stunting intellectual growth in Ismaili communities. The limitations on scholarly freedom to venture into certain areas produces a ceiling on the use of the mind. This environment has pervaded and debilitated the consciousness of the wider community, which has generally come to accept the notion that the intellect is to be restricted. Ismailis have made remarkable achievements in light of their generally humble status 1 century ago. However, despite building schools, academies, institutes, and universities, they appear to have placed intellectual restraints on themselves. This has hitherto limited the global significance of the movement's accomplishments. I would like to repeat one of the earlier mentioned quotes of the Aga Khan here. Central Asia, 1,000 years ago, led the world in cultural and intellectual achievements. This happened because the societies were open to new ideas, open to change, open to scholars and people from many backgrounds. That kind of openness can again unlock the doors to the future and allow us to take on the great questions of our time and place. Close quotes. Ismaili communities today seem unfortunately to be far from this vision. Let us now turn to the category of the people of faith. A recent book with People of Faith as its title, published by a communal institution, refers to various characteristics of adherents. It addresses their expressions of piety, their service in the cause of faith, their wealth and prosperity, and their generosity in supporting communal programs. Whereas ethics are mentioned in a theoretical context, the contemporary heirs of Dawat al-Haq and Satpanth are not seen as actively engaging in the pursuit of knowledge and truth. A pious, giving people who do not ask questions would be the ideal of a communal hierarchy that seeks an untroubled existence. I would posit that people of faith range from persons who are thoughtful about their circumstances to those who do not ask questions and are loyal to the extent of being cultish. They also have a range of educational profiles, including people with little formal schooling, professionals, and individuals with higher degrees. However, education does not determine how people address issues of truth. Over many generations, children have generally been socialized to be faithful and obedient in the community. In preparing curricula, guiding questions such as, what does a believer need to know and understand about the faith, seem to conceptualize a mainly passive reception of information rather than an interactive formation of the believer's mind. This appears to contradict the Quranic encouragement to think for oneself, or the periodic Ismaili exhortation to use the individual's intellect and engage in personal search. It is remarkable that even some individuals engaged in critical thought about other areas of inquiry close their mind when it comes to matters of faith. The intellectual achievements of historical figures are lauded in communal discourse, but their endeavors of rigorous inquiry are not presented as models for asking hard questions in the present. In adopting a mainly civilizational framework for religious education, glories of, quote, the golden age enthrall, but simultaneously imprison minds. Past achievements are emphasized, but the causes of failures, which can serve as important lessons for today, are rarely discussed in textbooks. Fatimid grandeur is exalted, but valuable knowledge about the corruption that led to the state's collapse are obscured. The program seems to be to acculturate people of faith to provide service without questioning. A blind eye is to be turned to the misuses of power and unethical conduct when they occur, even when underlings are deeply troubled about them. I would like to give an example of a PhD candidate who disseminates information about Ismaili institutions and individuals from his daily internet search, who said that he did not forward items that presented unflattering information because he did not want to, quote, wash dirty linen in public. Such practices, which stem from the concern of the community and its leadership losing public status, contributes to a lack of accountability and does not produce improvement in communal institutions. According to a critical Ismaili scholar, this, quote, archaeology of fear strengthens the bureaucracy's hold on the community, unquote. The search for truth, a central Ismaili value, is repeatedly compromised in the effort that is supposed to protect the community. When one cannot face some awkward facts about the group, one is far away from taking on the great questions of our time and place. In the long term, this limitation on thought effectively results in the failure to produce intellectual excellence and the possibility of making substantial global achievements. The internet has provided opportunities to disseminate communal critiques widely. Whereas some discussions are informed, respectful, and constructive, others tend to be unfair and vengeful. Some are even vulgar and personally abusive. Individuals who are genuinely searching for the truth often have difficulty making sense of what sounds like babble on the internet. The tendency among many of the faithful is to avoid the material. Nevertheless, some fairly slick productions on platforms like YouTube have raised questions among some community members. The response from institutions is generally to disregard the internet-based critiques and discussions, which nevertheless are monitored. This has been a long-standing practice from the time that print materials were dominant. Sooner or later, the problem went away. However, that terrain may have shifted given the characteristics of social media, which enable ongoing discussions and the presentation of information in a variety of forms. The communal hierarchies and bureaucracies may find themselves having to change their strategies. As I near the end of my address, I would like to consider the way forward. In light of the Quranic as well as the Ismaili theological and philosophical orientation towards the intellect, a serious rethinking needs to be conducted about the ways in which knowledge and truth are addressed in the present day. As mentioned before, an enormous investment has been made over the last century in education, and there have been significant achievements. However, the promise of Dawat al-Haq seems elusive in our times. Knowledge appears to have become an instrument of expediency to meet short-term goals. It has not been allowed to flower in a nourishing environment. Members of the movement within or without communal organizations do not seem to be asking the great questions of our time and place. Inquiries that seek to probe areas that are deemed sensitive are discouraged, if not entirely prohibited. However, there is an incipient challenge to the status quo developing from some community members and scholars. A sustained critique is beginning to take shape. Communal hierarchies cannot continue to bury their heads in the sand like the proverbial ostrich and hope that this too will pass. Let us look at what may be possible to do. This very conference is an example of one of the ways in which scholarship about the movement can be re-energized. The International Ismaili Studies Conferences, of which this is the third, have become important autonomous platforms for academically based, community affiliated, and independent scholars to come together to present research and conduct discussions and debates in a collegial manner. The conference's principles, well, that's already been covered, so I won't take up time talking about them. But this is a civil society institution which is hosted at individual universities and is not controlled by any entity in order to ensure that it remains independent. It would be beneficial for communally affiliated organizations also to organize a parallel set of scholarly gatherings whose paper proposals are peer-reviewed by autonomous conference committees comprising independent academics and community-based scholars. The modus operandi would be objective and informed participation. Critical engagements would not be out of the realm of possibility at such gatherings. Hard questions, it is possible to ask hard questions with intelligence, honesty, and being respectful and having compassion. It would not be beneficial to engage in self-congratulation, apologetics, panegyrics, public relations, or propaganda. Such conferences may find it useful to consider the problems of knowledge politics and to frame the proceedings by what the concept of Dawat al-Haq would imply. The orientation of the believing intellectual to critical inquiry would be an important underlying basis for such gatherings. It is in the in-between, in the liminal zone, straddling belief and objectivity, where soul-searching and scholarly engagement are the most profound. This is where the scholar dedicated to truth faces the good soldier. Such soldiers fear the battleground, the battlefield of hard questions that challenge the certainty and comfort of set beliefs. It is the lot of the knowledge worker, on the other hand, to venture into areas of ambiguity where belief is held in contingency and often challenged by critique. When the unreconstructed managerial class administers the knowledge worker, the latter is made to labor under conditions that are not kind to the quest for truth. Moving forward in the spirit of Dawat al-Haq requires a coming together of scholars, soldiers, and people of faith, which, as I've said before, are overlapping categories. This requires an attitude of mutual understanding about the conditions under which each operates. If asking hard questions is an act of faith for believers, then they should have confidence in the sincere search for knowledge and truth. Such common ground will help to lay the foundation for moving forward to ask, quote, the great questions of our time and place. In closing, I sincerely thank the audience for having given me its time and its attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to applaud you aloud. I don't know if people can see that. Thank you so much, Professor Karim, for giving an address that, and I think your address really embodies the core value that you were speaking to. It was a truthful, authentic address. I think you have said out loud what many members of Ismaili communities, for whatever reason, cannot or will not say out loud. And just so you know, while you were speaking, I've been getting messages on WhatsApp and the chat and various other places with people very much invigorated by what you've said. I think given what you talked about, I think many people have found some catharsis in hearing your comments. You're expressing certain frustrations and critique that others without that privilege have not been able to express. So I thank you for that. So we have about 30 minutes. So what we're going to do is this. I'm the respondent. So I'm going to respond to some of the things you said. And I couldn't actually write an essay or anything, but what I did is I highlighted parts of your address and wrote my thoughts down next to that. So I'm going to give a response, which, maybe 5 to 7 minutes of a response. Then I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you, and then we'll get questions from everybody. So right now, for the audience, if you have questions that you want to be taken up by Dr. Karim, you can write them in the Q&A. For those who are panelists, you can write your questions in the panelist chat. So you can start that while I'm responding. So it's an honor for me to do this response. You sort of reached the pinnacle of an academic career, and I'm just at the beginning. So I sort of feel like a misfit of a sort, being the one to respond to you, but I'll try my best, and I'm sure you'll forgive me if it doesn't sound as eloquent as you. So again, this response is not an essay type response. I'm not making really an argument, but some of what you said from the very beginning just triggered sort of responsive thoughts from me. So that's all I'm going to do. You mentioned at the very beginning, you mentioned how the Islamic cogito appears very much within a spiritual frame. And you've mentioned intellect, akal, throughout this talk. And at that, what that triggered for me is that it seems that one of the reasons for these deficiencies, Dr. Karim, that you have spoken to is the concept of intellect has changed in the Ismaili community and other Muslim communities' historical understandings. So we know, for example, going back to the earliest primary sources in the Shi'i tradition that talk about aql, that aql was not merely reasoning. It was not merely a step-by-step rationalization toward the goal of getting something done. Nor was aql merely an instrument for good arguments for debate. It included this, but aql in the earliest primary source material appears as a spiritual organ of truth-seeking and truth perception, a truth that involves not just spiritual truth and not just truths about the world, but ethical truth, beauty, things like this. And this notion of aql as a truth perceiving faculty, different from the brain, not reducible to the brain. This idea, it's in the earliest Shi'i tradition, but it also continues in the Ismaili philosophical tradition. Someone like Nasser Khusro talked about how aql, intellect, is that by which the human soul recognizes itself. So to put this in more layman's term, it seems to me that the traditional Ismaili understanding of intellect, which is shared with certain other Muslim groups, is that everyone has some cognitive participation in objectivity. It's not a total participation, but it is an access to objectivity. That's what the intellect provides. And I think over the centuries, and perhaps this is a symptom of modernity, that notion of intellect as having access to objectivity has somewhat been lost. The intellect now gets treated as a purely subjective epistemic faculty. And when that's the case, if everyone's intellect is just reduced to a subjectivity only without a participation in objectivity, in that situation, the only way that you ought to follow someone else's views is basically through authoritarian imposition, right? Not because something is more true or less true. So that was my thought from the beginning. You mentioned quite rightly Dawat al-Haq, Ahl al-Haq, Ahli Haq, Ahli Hakikat, Dini Haq, and so on, Satpant. And the only thing I would add to that, which you're quite aware of, is Haq, the concept of Haq is not singular in its modality. It may be singular in its ontology. There is one Haq, but of course, the Ismaili tradition, pre-modern Ismaili tradition, always recognized levels of manifestation or modality of that truth. The most common framework is Zahir and Batin, but we also know from these sources that there are many levels of Batin. So you arrive at one Batin and there's a Batin, above that, so to speak. And also the modalities of this Haq are correlated to human faculties of knowing. So the Naisaburi, who you've quoted in that Code of Conduct book, he talks about three modalities, three levels of perceiving this Haq. There's sensory truth, then there's imaginal truth, which is sort of, you could say, conceptual, but then there's intellectual, truly akli Haq, which is to know things, to know truths as they truly are. So in other words, at the level of pure intellect, things are fully objective. But anything short of pure intellect, there is subjectivity. And you've talked about in your address some of those subjectivities, which are constraints. To relate that to what you're saying, in the modern period, in our communities, if we fail to recognize the hierarchy of Haq and we reduce truth to just one ideology, one position, one task, then the notion of hierarchy, because humans are hierarchical, that notion of hierarchy that was a epistemic hierarchy, that is supplanted by a different kind of hierarchy, which is merely an obedience hierarchy based on the promotion of ideology, right, and power. So that was the next thought I had, that you talked about in the modern period how we have certain mechanisms to help, ensure truth seeking, in an enabling environment. You mentioned things like peer review, for example. I think one critique of peer review, which I know from experience, is even in academia, those in power, those who are tenured professors and peer reviewers, power is not distributed according to truth. It should be, but it's not, right? Those in power are not necessarily the most truthful or the most committed to truth. So sometimes even the modern mechanisms we have to ensure an enabling environment of truth seeking, those mechanisms themselves are deficient within all institutions, because those in power are not necessarily committed to truth. They may only be committed to staying in power, right? So that's sort of even one limitation of some of those mechanisms. Let me just keep going here. One question, and I'll repeat the question, but I just want to state it. Someone will ask, you quoted Hazar Imam's, His Highness the Aga Khan's 1986 guidance to the USA institutions. And you can come back to that, but someone will always ask, why is there such a lack of alignment between what the Imam says and what the community does at the institutional level? So that's something you can get to in Q&A. You talked about critical thinking, and you said that it's incorrectly thought of as criticism for its own sake. So I think this is a point where you could perhaps further unpack in the Q&A. How do you know whether you're being critical or whether you're just being polemical, for example, right? The person who launches a critique, they themselves still hold some sort of position. So is every type of critique then going to somewhat be polemical and in the service of somebody's power? Perhaps the one who offers a critique, like you or me, someone may tell us that, well, you're only doing this because you're trying to arrogate power for yourself. So I think that power question comes in. How do we be authentic critics and not just power seekers? Let me just keep going here. Another thing would be that when you mentioned, hard questions are not being asked and so on. In my experience, I think the idea of asking hard questions is there in our communities. People like to talk about asking questions, and sometimes questions are asked, but in my experience, I find that actually there's a resistance to answers, even. Unless it's the ready-made ideological answer, but there tends to be a resistance to answers that themselves have been well thought and systematized using, different types of arguments. This has been my own experience, that we like the idea of truth seeking, but I find that in our communities, we are very resistant to truth finding. When someone wants to make a truth claim, especially when they're not part of the bureaucracy, that person's truth claim is often relativized. So I'm finding in my experience, if the problem you're talking about, that it's not the one issue, the issue is not only that a type of ideological truth is being imposed, but other truth claims, right, that have been well researched are relegated to, well, that's just your interpretation. Thank you for sharing it, right? It's almost this sort of epistemic relativism gets used by the professional managerial class to counter, because when you cannot counter a truth claim through argument, you just try to relativize the truth claim. You try to make, so this is the tactic that I'm seeing, that if you're an ideologue and your main goal is to maintain the power and status quo, you're not really interested in truth claims and argument. What you need to do is you need to reduce every truth claim down to the same level. And when that's the case, people cannot pick a truth claim based on what's more convincing. They will have to pick the truth claim that is imposed. And then that's sort of what the power hierarchies do. Let me just keep going. I'll add just two more comments. I think one broader question that we all have to answer, especially those who are Ismailis and those who are Nizari Ismailis in all this. So, the Ismaili bureaucracy makes the claim, and it's somewhat valid, that they have been tasked by the Imam to carry out, certain parts of the Imam's vision, and that their work is just fulfilling this objective, and that they command obedience of the community to that extent. And of course, they root their claim to obedience in the Ismaili theology that, the Imam is infallible and the Imam should be obeyed. How does a critical scholar deal with something of that sort? One solution that I've come to in the form of a question is, is the Ismaili tariqa, is the Ismaili faith centered on obedience for its own sake, or is it centered on truth seeking, where obedience is done in the service of truth seeking and truth finding? And I think that the whole thing comes down to how we answer that question. If it's just obedience for its own sake, then Ismailism is basically a religion of taqlid, and Ghazali would be correct. But if it's obedience in the service of truth seeking and truth finding, where the Imam's guidance, whether it's Farman or Hidayah, if the Imam's guidance is a complement, if it's supplementing your own truth seeking, right, then you still obey at the end of the day, but that obedience is for the sake of the ends of truth finding. Otherwise, if you remove that and you simply turn it into a taqlidi or authoritarianism, then it would demand obedience not just to the imam, but unquestioned obedience to hierarchies and so on. The last thing I will just say before we go to questions, I guess it would be this, that you've talked about, well, you haven't mentioned it, but when we talk about this conference and other conferences, my thing would be that these conferences are good, obviously, and they've done a lot, but these conferences cannot just talk about the past, because the past is dead unless you bring that past to the present. So that's why one reason I invited you to give this keynote, because you speak to the present, not just the past. So do you think there's an overt focus in Ismaili scholarship just on the past? You don't see much scholarship about the present, even constructive theological scholarship. The IIS hasn't published anything, any modern day constructive theological scholarship, but they're very comfortable in translating what Kirmani wrote or what Nasser Khusro wrote. Perhaps it's because it's in the past, so it cannot harm the public relations messaging, because you could just say, well, that was 1,000 years ago. Whereas today, I think there's a fear that theological claims and metaphysical claims to some members in our community are seen as a source of embarrassment, and therefore all of that tends to be discouraged. But anyway, that's my brief response. So what I'm going to do now is, we have a ton of questions well, some of them are questions and comments. So I'm going to repeat one of my questions to you, and you can just start with that, and then we'll go to the other ones. So one question I asked you earlier on was, I'll merge them. Do you think we have lost the original sense of aql that we have within this Dawat al-Haq tradition? And aql has now just been reduced to just a superficial kind of reasoning. And part of that, do you think that with this impoverished notion of aql, how do you draw the line between critique, right, being critical, and just polemically criticizing?
Okay, so that's a very important question. It's a big question, and thank you so much for, again, inviting me to do this. And I very much appreciate the way that you have formulated the response. These are very probing questions, and one has to think about, how to respond. Yes, there is a disconnect, a historical disconnect between the original, or the earlier notion of aql. We have to, I think, to a certain extent, take into account the work of contemporary philosophy, and by contemporary, I mean going all the way back to the Enlightenment, and perhaps to the Renaissance, and the impact that it has had on Muslim thinkers and the way we think about intelligence, the intellect. Often these two words, become synonymous, not in the way that you describe, in terms of the organ of truth, of truth seeking. Yes, Nesaburi, but I found also the work of Ibn Arabi, especially in the way that Corbin has discussed it, discussing the notion of the imaginal. This is the notion of akal is very, very powerful. And interestingly, some Western philosophers are trying to understand this concept of the imaginal and the power that this faculty has in discerning truth. Again, this is an ideal. We cannot point, I don't know whether it's in the brain or what part of the body, the heart, but it seems to be a faculty that the human being, the larger human being, encompassing the spirit of the human being, that this is something that we possess and that we have lost sight of. So obviously there's a whole range of questions here. So this is what I'd like to say about this, that yes, there is a change. Modernity and modern philosophical thought has something to do about it in terms of reducing its value. And what we need to, I think, understand for our part is to get to revalorize the intellect, the akal, and completely have a sense of how it relates to truth. Again, even truth is such a difficult topic. I spent some time talking about it, but obviously there are the debates of absolute and relative truth, which you also touched on. And so one would imagine that akal, the way that you describe it as, in the previous sources, relates to the notion of an absolute truth. And whether that exists or not is under very strong attack. And, perhaps rightly so. We need to understand, we need to have a fulsome understanding of these various concepts. Obviously, this is not the time or place to do it. There just isn't enough time to go into all that. But we have seen, I might be sort of, going into some of your later questions, but this is all related, the relativity of truth. And so one of the questions that I saw in the chat is, what is meant by the big questions? And so this is one of the big questions, especially what has happened over the last 5 years in various parts of the world. Truth has come under attack, but truth not even in the way that we're talking about it, just facts. And notions such as post-truth and so on have emerged because of the political situation, and not only in the United States, but in India, in Hungary, in various other places. This is not a new phenomenon, but to the level to which it has been taken has made people think about what is truth, his truth, her truth. This is your interpretation. This is for your benefit. We have the truth. And what people are able to do politically when they have the power, when they have the command of the media. In this case, it was new media. It was, I'm referring to Trump, and how he was able singularly to be able to use one platform, Twitter, to present, in a dogged determination to use that at various times of the day, even the early morning, to convince so many people, not all, of course, that he was speaking the truth, that he was the source of truth. So this is a very contested territory. And so this is one of the big questions. And people who have claimed, who have self-identified with truth, with the mission to truth, with the invitation to truth, with the path of truth, we have a long history in dealing with this topic. And so surely we should be able to contribute to contemporary discourses. Of course, these are one of my tasks. I teach in the School of Journalism and Communication, and I constantly have to, of course, part of my training is in Islamic studies, and I engage in Ismaili studies. And I also, most of the courses I teach, there isn't a single religious studies course that I teach, but this very debate allowed me to teach courses both at the undergraduate and the graduate level to discuss with students the concept of truth and post-truth. Admittedly, when I brought in certain religious thought about truth, the students did not respond very well because communication students are not attuned to that kind of thinking. But it does enable us to then reconsider and develop our own critique, our own theology and our own philosophy in light of what is happening today. What are the big questions? This is one of the big questions. So what are we bringing to it? And I think we have a lot that we have thought about. When I say we, of course, this is part of the tradition. And it is possible to have this conversation in the contemporary world. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time discussing just that one topic, so I'll pass it back to you.
So a couple things. This was scheduled to end at 2:20, but we're going to go till 2:30 until the next panel starts, if that's okay with you, so we can get more questions for you. So here's what we're going to do. So questions from our panelists, other people in the panel. So I'm going to do this. If anyone who's on the panel, these are conference participants, wants to ask a live question, you can raise your hand. So Sayed, I see your hand. Did you want to ask a question to Professor Karim?
Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. It's so good to meet you, Professor Karim. Thank you for giving this very important and wonderful talk. And I followed your work, and I was very happy to find that you accepted to be a part of our conference. My name is Saeed Zaidi. I'm a PhD candidate at Emory University, and I'm working on the Ikhwan Safa, on the Brethren of Purity. Not exactly related to the talk here, but in some ways related to these big questions that you're asking and the current situation, the current relations between different Shiite communities. I'm sure you know that a few months ago there was a major conference at Harvard about different the relationships and the conversations between 12 Imami Shiites, Ismaili Shiites, Zaydis, etc. And I was wondering, what were your thoughts on how we can bring 12 Imami Shiites and Ismaili Shiites closer together in terms of conversation? Obviously, I'm not looking for a merging or anything. What I'm looking for is a channel of communication for us to be able to understand what our similarities are, what our differences are, and how we can actually be able to help each other in the name of Islam, in the name of Islamic studies, in the name of the other being able to understand us. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question, and thank you, Zaid. Saeed, yes, I did watch part of that conference, and it was very encouraging to see that kind of a conference being organized, and the various. I think I'm speaking about the right conference. It covered a variety of Shia groups, and that was very, very forward-thinking, and I really liked what happened there. So just quickly, obviously these various groups have a certain sense, a certain identity, and a certain leadership, which tries to preserve that identity. What I have found in my work, not only among Shia and not only among Muslims, but between whether it's Ismailis, Itnashris, Sunnis, there is so much give and take between various religious traditions. We put ourselves in these boxes, and I'm so happy to see that there is the growth, for example, in what is sometimes called Jewish Ismailism, the engagement of Ismailis and Jews in terms of philosophy and theology, because this is what happens in the real world. People engage with each other, they share ideas. This is what's happening today with secular philosophy. We look at so many different ways of thinking, and the human mind does not box itself, rigidly into certain forms of thinking. So, as a first step to recognize the give and take between various groups is a very important one, is a very, very important issue. I find, for example, on a related point, the work of Amir Moizi very, very interesting in a general Shia perspective, but also as an Ismaili, notions of spirituality, notions of imamat, and so on. And so there's a lot to understand from each other. And these can be the starting points. And when people get together, interesting things happen, you know, when they have a common purpose and they come with open arms. So I would certainly encourage more events like those. I look forward to that. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions from panelists? Again, you can raise your hand and ask a live question. So any of our panelists. There was a question in the chat from Dr. Karim Javan. Karim, do you want to ask your question live again?
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Khalil, for letting me to raise the question live. In light of the discussion that Professor Karim had, a question came to my mind that this intellectual freedom in our institutions and in our community in general today is, as we all recognize, is in a challenge. Basically, if all Ismailis live in one polity in one country with an Ismaili state, just a hypothetical question, like for example, Islamic Republic in Iran, and the Imam as the head of the state, considering the standards and the practice that we have in our institutions now, I mean, do you think we will have the same challenges that a Shia state like Iran has? We will have the same challenge. What is the relation of Ismailism, Ismaili thought with democracy? Because this compatibility of Islam with democracy nowadays is a very hot topic among all Muslim intellectuals. These are, I think, very relevant issues that we as Ismailis and all people living in this time need to ask ourselves, that probably among our da'is or authors, intellectuals in the past, this wasn't an issue, but now it is an issue. And I haven't seen really much discussion among our Ismaili friends, intellectuals, and scholars. Thank you.
Okay, so let me quickly take that on. So we've had, supposedly a situation where there was an Ismaili state. We all know about it. It was called the Fatimid state, which is now called the Fatimid state. Yet, I mean, I quoted Nesaburi because he was complaining about things going wrong. The state was led by the Imam, who was Caliph, and yet within the Dawah, there were problems. But this speaks to a bigger problem, and I think it's one of the things that you raised, Khalil, as well, with respect to the Imam basically, asking the community to do certain things and having a certain vision, and the community or the leadership, whoever you want to put the blame on, goes in the wrong direction or in a different direction. It speaks to a bigger problem of ethics and administration, because there are the contingencies of getting things done. A state is any community is a very difficult thing to run, and compromises, political compromises, administrative compromises are constantly being made, as they happened in under the Fatimids as they're happening in Iran or anywhere else, any society that sees itself as an ethical society, and I think most societies see themselves, whether they are religious or not, see themselves as good people, as good societies, as a good state, having a constitution or having a set of ethics by which they are run. But the actual day-to-day administration compels administrators to take those shortcuts that I talked about. And what is the self-reflection? What is the reflection, the self-reflexiveness that is demanded of individuals and of leaders in these circumstances? How do I make a decision? I think that is a big question. That is not, as again, it's one of those big questions that need to be addressed by people around the world. And you know, we have had a certain experience, both as a state and now as part of a transnational community that has institutions, administrative institutions. Where is the compromise and how are those compromises done? What is the thinking? What is the ethical thinking that is demanded here? What are the practicalities of it? And that's what my critique of the ethical framework of the AKDN is. It doesn't address the practicalities. It is a good document in terms of laying out the theory and the vision. But how do we get this done? And that's where, to use a tired phrase, the rubber meets the road.
I'm going to go to questions that are in the chat box. So, I mean, look, I'll ask 2 or 3 of them just in the interest of time. So one question, which a little pushback on what you've said, is that, you know, aren't institutions supposed to manage the risks such as reputation, misuse of information, sensitivity, so other groups like Wahhabis do not misquote Ismaili thought and things like that. So in other words, isn't risk management, you know, imperative, right, within any institution, including ours? That was one question. Another question that has been asked, although you don't have to answer this and we can save it for another panel because we could do a whole panel on it, but another question being asked is, well, is the Imam infallible or not? And if I were to edit the question a little bit, it would be the second question. It would be, within an Ismaili perspective, if you subscribe to the idea of an Imam whose guidance is infallible, how much room is left for critique in this sort of thing? And as you can see, both these questions are sort of linked, right? Because sometimes it's very easy for bureaucratic leadership to appropriate the believed infallibility of the Imam to themselves. So it puts the follower in the community who wants to be a pious follower, it puts that person in a difficult position, right? How do you deal with institutions who claim to speak for an infallible Imam? And then some people will say, well, if the institutions are doing something undesirable, maybe the Imam got it wrong or some stuff like this. So those are tough questions, but I think you could speak to them.
Okay, so let's deal with risk management first. Again, a big question, and it relates to not only to us, but generally. Where do you draw the line? How many compromises do you make about who you are? What are your principles? What are your ethics? What are your values? What is your history? What do you really believe in? Yes, we have taqiyya, but I don't know if you're practicing it today, or we are perhaps. I don't know. It's not officially called that. These are questions that we need to ask ourselves. How many compromises will we make? And so I refer to the term archaeology of fear. And I think it is, I'm not sure. I think Faisal Devji might have coined that or used it from someone else. And this is, in a way, a tactic that is used by the powers that be to stop discussions, to prevent certain kinds of publications, to discuss what is what are our own beliefs. And so we keep retreating. And with this retreat, we forget, I think sometimes, what are our real values? Because we're constantly talking about things to cover ourselves, or not talking about them at all. And so this is a question that that we need to ask ourselves as to how do we live in a world which is a dangerous world, but where do we draw the line? How do we use language? Because obviously we have a tradition of using several levels of writing, and leaving certain things to ta'wil. So how do we revive that? Is that possible? I know I'm throwing out some questions at you, but this is something that we need to obviously think very hard about, as to how do we deal with the situation in a transnational community which is often under threat. But then we are a community that, despite serious threats through its history, has survived and continues to flourish in different parts of the world. The other question, I know this is a very loaded question about the Imam's infallibility, and some people see it as an article of faith, but then infallibility in what aspects of life? I guess a core belief would be in spiritual matters. But then if we were to extend this to material, to dunya, does the Imam know everything? Why does he need advisors? Why does he discuss things with people? Why does he need research? These are questions to be asked about the question of infallibility. And has the Imam, or has any Imam, never made a mistake? I think history would say something quite different. Okay.
All right, well, we are at the end of our time. So once again, on behalf of the organizers, the participants, and all the attendees, Professor Karim, thank you so much for being with us, for giving an authentic, forthright, forthcoming address, and for touching some of those questions that just have not been touched on for various reasons for many, many decades. So I hope that people will hear your address. As some of you know, this is all on YouTube. It's being streamed right now, and you can go back up until the end of August and rewatch these things. So I hope many people will hear what you've had to say, and I hope it will spark some conversations, and I hope it will inspire some positive change in our respective communities, a change towards a more sincere and focused search for this truth or truths. So thank you all. Thank you very much, Professor Karim. We're now going to go right to panel 3 for today.